Muy buenas noches. Doctor Leonel Fernández, expresidente de la República, presidente de la Fundación Global Democracia y Desarrollo. Doctor César Pina Toribio, consultor jurídico del Poder Ejecutivo. Distinguidos miembros del cuerpo consular y diplomático acreditado en la República Dominicana. Autoridades civiles, militares, académicas, directores y coordinadores de los centros de estudios de Funglode, miembros de la comunidad árabe en la República Dominicana, amigos todos. En nombre de la Fundación Global Democracia y Desarrollo, es un placer darles la bienvenida a este panel de discusión denominado La situación actual en Siria, un conflicto con consecuencias globales. El conflicto en Siria se ha ido desarrollando desde que se inició en varias ciudades y poblados a raíz de protestas simultáneas que iniciaron en marzo 15 del año 2011 como una parte de la ola ya conocida como la primavera árabe. Sin embargo, se suma al principio, como parte de este movimiento, se suma a la campaña de resistencia no violenta que le pedía a los gobiernos de la región reformas trascendentales que influyeran en el modo de vida de la población del Medio Oriente. Sin embargo, en abril del 2011, las fuerzas gubernamentales de Siria se desataron con una fuerte ofensiva y decenas de protestantes fueron asesinados. Los movimientos de protestas empezaron a transformarse en movimientos insurgentes, con una gran variedad de grupos armados entresecados entre la ciudadanía común y combatiendo a las fuerzas regulares, poniendo así en jaque el control del país. A medida que la crisis se ha ido desarrollando, la insurgencia ha convertido el proceso en una total guerra civil, con una numerosa cantidad de agencias internacionales y expertos, estimando que el conflicto definitivamente alcanza esta categoría. Así lo evidencia, entre otras definiciones, lo subrayado por el Comité Internacional de la Cruz Roja, cuando en julio del 2011 declara formalmente esta situación como un conflicto armado de carácter no internacional, el cual es el término técnico que se utiliza para describir precisamente los procesos de guerra civil, en la cual, para que la ley de ayuda humanitaria internacional pueda ingresar a esos territorios. Y igualmente la Convención de Viena, esa es la calificación que da este tipo de conflictos. El campo de batalla se ha movido desde aquellas pequeñas ciudades y zonas alejadas a las más importantes urbes y ya se mueven en ciudades grandes como Damasco y Alepo. Las fuerzas del gobierno han incrementado la potencia de fuego y han incluido en los mismos tanques, morteros, ametralladoras de calibre pesado, así como también fuerza aérea y helicópteros de ataques y jet bombarderos. Las fuerzas rebeldes, por su parte, también han tenido la oportunidad de incrementar su capacidad de fuego, adquiriendo armamento pesados, incluyendo algunos de aquellos que se han capturado o comprado a las fuerzas gubernamentales y que se han adquirido en la batalla. La violencia en este momento ha alcanzado nuevos límites sobre la ciudad más grande e importante comercialmente hablando en Siria, que se trata de la ciudad de Alepo. La pérdida humana de este conflicto ha llevado a niveles escalofriantes realmente y solamente se incrementa a medida que pasa el tiempo. Se estima que hay un rango entre 20 y 30 mil personas que han perecido en estos últimos 18 meses y se estima que al menos la mitad de esta cantidad de personas son civiles desarmados. Las Naciones Unidas estiman que 1.5 de millones de sirios han sido desplazados y muchos otros han tenido que partir hacia refugios en el Líbano, Jordania y sobre todo en Turquía. Turquía ha reportado que actualmente cuenta con más de 100.000 refugiados sirios y en estos momentos se encuentra bloqueando la frontera para aquellos que quieren cruzar, lo que ha provocado que en la actualidad se cuente con una suma indeterminada que ronda entre 5 y 15.000 personas en tierra de nadie. Sumado a esto, podemos destacar además que un sinnúmero de atrocidades que según Naciones Unidas y otras agencias multilaterales son atribuidas a ambos lados, particularmente al ejército irregular llamado Shabija, que no es más que una milicia progubernamental, pero también hay fuerzas de la oposición acusadas de ejecuciones irregulares y otros abusos serios. El gobierno se debilita lentamente, pero también la oposición aparece fragmentada y dividida. Aparentemente hay una brecha significativa entre los pensamientos políticos de la oposición y los de los rebeldes que se encuentran en el campo de batalla. La crisis en Siria ha tenido un impacto significativamente desestabilizador, tanto sobre la región como en un desestabilizamiento a nivel global. El conflicto se ha desprendido hasta el norte del Líbano y con algunas excepciones en algunas partes de Irak. La tensión ha corrido por toda la frontera turco-siria, donde los grupos kurdos de Siria, incluyendo el PKK, el cual tiene una larga historia de conflictos con Turquía, ha declarado la zona norte como autónoma. Numerosas agencias internacionales han reportado que tanto Rusia como Irán han estado de manera continua supliendo a los gobiernos sirios, tanto al gobierno como a la oposición, con significativos cargamentos de armas. Así como también del bando opuesto se reportan cargamentos de armas llegando desde Turquía y otras fuentes de igual importancia. En respuesta a esta crisis, la Liga Árabe ha suspendido a Siria de sus filas en noviembre del 2011 y muchos de los esfuerzos realizados tanto por la Liga Árabe como por las Naciones Unidas hasta la fecha han sido en vano. La esperanza por que surja una solución pacífica al conflicto ahora descansa sobre los hombros del diplomático argelino, quien es una persona especializada en resolución alternativa de conflictos, el señor Lakhdar Brahimi, quien ha reemplazado al exsecretario general de las Naciones Unidas, Kofi Annan, como enviado especial conjunto de las Naciones Unidas y la Liga Árabe ante este conflicto. Brahimi ha anunciado anuncia que ha iniciado consultas con la Liga Árabe y con algunos oficiales egipcios para desarrollar un plan de trabajo formal antes de su primera visita a Siria. Las consecuencias del conflicto sirio no están limitadas solamente a sus fronteras o a sus vecinos inmediatos. Se ha convertido en un conflicto que va más allá de la región y que no solamente tiene la capacidad de desestabilizar el Medio Oriente completo, sino mucho más allá de esas fronteras. También trae consigo la posibilidad de poderosas tensiones globales, regionales y rivalidades internacionales, así como diferencias políticas y sectarias que pueden llegar también a convertirse, que rayan también en diferencias hasta ideológicas. El conflicto se ha convertido en un punto focal de muchas contradicciones y una lucha con grandes implicaciones. Definitivamente lo que sucede en el porvenir va a determinar el futuro estratégico de la región del Medio Oriente. Sin embargo, la cuestión siria es una crisis de importancia global. Sus implicaciones han tenido repercusiones en todo el mundo y aunque generalmente en la República Dominicana, América Latina y el Caribe no son influenciadas directamente, sus consecuencias se pueden ver y se pueden sentir, como puede ser, por ejemplo, la desestabilización de los precios en los combustibles que se generan a raíz de estas tensiones en la región. Es una situación de naturaleza compleja y que actualmente acapara la atención mundial. Por eso que en la noche de hoy Funglode ha convocado a un panel de expertos que me permito presentar más adelante para ayudarnos a entender las causas, las consecuencias posibles del conflicto, su estado actual y las perspectivas que presenta en el futuro inmediato. Antes de presentar a ustedes el panel que va a sostener la discusión el día de hoy, vamos a pasar un breve video de unos 8 minutos con una cronología audiovisual de lo relatado para luego pasar a introducir el panel e iniciar el debate sobre el tema.
Siria, país ubicado en la orilla oriental del mar Mediterráneo y que comparte fronteras con Turquía, Irak, Israel, Jordania y Líbano. En esta nación habitan cerca de 20 millones de habitantes que tienen al árabe como su idioma oficial y que en su mayoría profesan el Islam como religión. Su capital, Damasco, conocida como el Jardín del Islam, presume de ser la metrópolis continuamente habitada más antigua del mundo. Desde el año 1963, el Partido del Renacimiento Árabe Socialista o Baas gobierna Siria bajo la declaratoria de estado de emergencia y desde 1970 el presidente de Siria ha pertenecido a la familia Assad. Actualmente, Bashar, hijo de Hafez al-Assad, enfrenta, según la propia Cruz Roja Internacional, una guerra civil que a la fecha ha cobrado la vida de más de 25.000 personas. La mecha de las protestas se encendió el 15 de marzo de 2011, luego de que familiares de menores de edad que fueron detenidos por pintar grafitis contestatarios se manifestaran e iniciaran un ciclo de protestas en las que participaron miles de personas bajo el eslogan "Una Siria sin tiranía ni ley de emergencia". 2 semanas después, el presidente sirio se dirigió a la nación y denunció una conspiración en su contra. En julio, las protestas seguían vivas y miles de personas se manifestaron en la ciudad de Hama para pedir la dimisión de al-Assad con la venia de los embajadores de Estados Unidos y Francia, un gesto que fue calificado de provocación e injerencia por parte del régimen sirio. A principios de agosto y coincidiendo con el inicio del Ramadán, las fuerzas militares de Siria logran sitiar la ciudad de Hama, un bastión hasta ese entonces dominado por los opositores al gobierno. Esta operación dejó 80 personas muertas. A mediados de agosto, la ONU publicó un informe en el que acusa al gobierno sirio de cometer crímenes contra la humanidad. En octubre, mientras tanto, Rusia y China impidieron una resolución del Consejo de Seguridad que planteaba una estrategia similar a la utilizada en Libia contra el líder Muammar Gaddafi. En noviembre, países de la Liga Árabe comienzan a retirarle el respaldo a Siria y el 14 de noviembre el propio rey Abdullah de Jordania expresó claramente que si estuviera en el lugar de al-Assad, renunciaría. Casi 9 meses después del inicio del conflicto, Bashar al-Assad concedió la primera entrevista televisada a un medio de comunicación de Occidente.
No hemos matado a nuestro pueblo. Ningún gobierno puede asesinar a su gente, a menos que esté liderado por un loco. Yo me hice presidente por el apoyo del pueblo. Es imposible para cualquiera en este estado dar la orden de matar. Uno no puede sentirse culpable cuando da lo mejor. Puedes sentirte mal por las vidas que se han perdido, pero no puedes sentirte culpable si no has matado a nadie.
En enero, la Liga Árabe solicitó a al-Assad que transfiriera sus poderes al vicepresidente y formara un gobierno de unidad nacional que dirigiera el país hacia elecciones libres. Sin embargo, el gobierno sirio rechazó esta hoja de ruta. En febrero, también se propuso una nueva resolución en el Consejo de Seguridad de Naciones Unidas, en el que se solicitó la renuncia de al-Assad. Sin embargo, Rusia y China volvieron a vetarlo. El 3 de febrero de 2012, la oposición siria denunció que los bombardeos de las fuerzas leales al gobierno sobre la ciudad rebelde de Homs dejaron al menos 260 muertos y 500 heridos. El régimen sirio atribuyó estos ataques a grupos terroristas. Días después, Naciones Unidas y la Liga Árabe nombraron al exsecretario general de la ONU, Kofi Annan, para negociar en este conflicto. Mayo de 2012 ha sido uno de los meses más cruciales en el conflicto sirio. El 25 de este mes, más de 90 civiles perdieron la vida, mientras que otras 500 resultaron heridas en la llamada masacre de Ula. En julio, fuerzas opositoras dieron un duro golpe al gobierno sirio cuando, con un atentado suicida, asesinaron a los 3 funcionarios militares más importantes del gobierno. Uno de ellos, Asef Shaukat, quien era el cuñado del presidente Bashar al-Assad. En agosto, y sin poder llevar adelante la misión de paz, Kofi Annan abandonó Siria por considerar insuficientes los esfuerzos de las potencias mundiales en la resolución de este conflicto.
Sin una presión internacional seria y unida, incluida la de las potencias de la región, es imposible para mí o para cualquiera obligar al gobierno sirio y a la oposición a tomar los pasos necesarios para empezar un proceso político.
Esta decisión obligó al propio secretario general de Naciones Unidas a advertir a la comunidad internacional sobre los peligros que representa una guerra civil en este estado del Medio Oriente.
El interés del pueblo sirio debe estar por encima de cualquier tipo de rivalidad o influencia. El conflicto en Siria es una prueba para todo lo que esta organización representa. No quiero que las Naciones Unidas de hoy fallen esa prueba.
Las últimas noticias que se desprenden del conflicto en Siria no son para nada alentadoras. Según el Fondo de las Naciones Unidas para la Infancia, UNICEF, al menos 1.600 personas fueron asesinadas en Siria la semana pasada. haciéndola la semana de mayor número de muertes en lo que va de guerra civil en ese país.
Gracias. Bueno, lamentable y compleja la situación actual de Siria. Y bueno, contamos en la noche de hoy con un panel de primera para analizar todos los eventos que hemos presenciado en el video, cuáles son las principales causas y qué perspectivas de futuro inmediato y a mediano plazo pues se pueden esperar de este conflicto. Tenemos como panelista primero al doctor Shibley Telhami, es profesor titular de la cátedra Anwar Sadat para la Paz y el Desarrollo de la Universidad de Maryland en College Park y es investigador sénior del Centro Saban de Brookings Institution. Fue profesor en las universidades de Cornell, Princeton, Columbia y Berkeley en California y ha sido asesor de la misión de los Estados Unidos ante las Naciones Unidas y miembro de la delegación estadounidense en el Comité Trilateral Estados Unidos, Israel, Palestina contra la incitación a la violencia y al terrorismo. Es colaborador de The Washington Post, The New York Times, Los Angeles Times y frecuentemente es colaborador también en las principales cadenas de noticias televisivas en los Estados Unidos para comentar sobre estos temas. El doctor Zaid Eyadat es politólogo y profesor de Derechos Humanos en la Universidad de Jordania, presidente de los Departamentos de Derechos Humanos y Desarrollo Humano, así como de Liderazgo y Desafíos Mundiales. Es autor de varios libros. Entre sus publicaciones más recientes figuran Public Reason and Islamic Reason y las revoluciones árabes postseculares del 2011, las revoluciones de dignidad, publicado en el 2012. El título lo estoy traduciendo al español, es Islam entre diálogos y, bueno, lo vamos a decir en inglés, Between Dialoguing and Mainstreaming, Psicología y Teoría de la Violencia Política en el año 2009 y El Cálculo del Consenso, una vía alternativa para la democracia árabe, entre otros. El panel será moderado y conducido por el doctor Shibley Telhami, por el doctor Hussein Ibish, investigador sénior en el American Task Force on Palestine de Washington. Es colaborador de varios periódicos en Estados Unidos y países del Medio Oriente, columnista semanal del Now Lebanon y del Daily Beast, Open Zion. Es editor y autor principal de 3 importantes estudios sobre crímenes de odio y las discriminaciones contra los estadounidenses de origen árabe. Y su libro más reciente es What's Wrong with the One State Agenda? ¿Qué tiene de malo la agenda del Estado único? ¿Y por qué, finalizando la ocupación y la paz en Israel con los palestinos, es todavía la meta nacional palestina? Sin más preámbulos, pues le voy a pasar la palabra para que inicie el diálogo entre los panelistas al doctor Hussein Ibish.
Thank you very much indeed. I'd like to thank Funglode. I'd like to thank you. I'd like to thank His Excellency, the President Fernandez, and everyone else who was Mustafa and everyone who helped to make this event possible. So thank you very much, and thank you very much for joining us this evening. Excuse me. Let me just say, as a matter of routine housekeeping, please put your cellular phones or pagers on vibrate or off. That's something that I have, through bitter experience, learned needs to be said at the beginning of every event. A bit of housekeeping first. Here's how we're going to approach the evening. We're going to have a dynamic conversation, not speeches, but a dynamic conversation between the three of us, which I will moderate for approximately 45 minutes. And then we will turn it over to you and have questions from the floor, which we will respond to for an additional 45 minutes. So that's essentially how we're going to approach this. Now, we had considered at the beginning to give you some background on Syria, but I actually think it's been fairly well covered. We will go back to basics at the outset, certainly, but I do think that the initial presentation and the film that you've watched gives you a reasonably strong sense of what Syria is, where it is, and what's been going on there. We're going to essentially use a framework of looking at how this conflict is unfolding and where it goes at three registers. You can think of it in almost like a wave or almost like concentric circles expanding outward. First, there's the local, the domestic. In other words, what's exactly happening in Syria and what is the future for Syria and Syrians and the various peoples who make up Syria. A secondary concentric circle expanding outward is the region. What effect will this conflict have in the region? What does its outcome imply for the strategic landscape in the broader Middle East? That's a second area of concern. And finally, a third and global register and ring is the international dimension. There is a powerful international aspect to what is going on in Syria and a competition among great powers. So let me just begin by asking Shibley to start with a very brief overview of where you think the conflict is right now in Syria and how you think it's starting to unfold.
Well, first of all, thank you very much for hosting me again. I'm grateful to the Funglode Foundation for inviting me here. This is the third or fourth time that I come here as a guest. Thank you, President Fernandez, and I commend you on the extraordinary forums that you have here and the quality of the events that I have attended. Congratulations, and thank you again for hosting me. Let me just start by saying why, in fact, Syria is so complicated. I mean, those of us who've been watching the Arab uprisings, Tunisia happened so quickly. The outcome was rapid, and Egypt was relatively rapid. And even in Libya, yes, there was an international intervention, but it happened relatively quickly. So why is it that Syria is so complicated? And let me start by saying there really are three major issues coming together in Syria. One issue is the obvious one. Syria is like everyone else, every place else in the Arab world. It is really witnessing a popular uprising against authoritarianism, just like we're seeing in everywhere else. People are fed up with authoritarian regimes. People are empowered. That's what we witnessed early on. But there is a second part which complicates it, which is in Syria, there really is sectarianism. And what we're seeing is elements of civil war on top of a genuine and legitimate popular uprising against an unpopular regime. And the third is because Syria is so strategically central to the neighboring states and touches on so many strategic issues having to do with Israel, Iran, Turkey, Lebanon, Iraq, that foreign powers have competing interests, not just interest. In Libya, they were less competitive in the sense, but in Syria, there are competing interests that makes it very difficult for people to agree on what to do. So you have three things going on, and even Arab public opinion at the same time is puzzled by what's happening. I do Arab public opinion polls. And I've done one on Syria just a few months ago. And what I find in Arab public opinion outside of Syria is not 90% of the public sympathizes with the rebels over the government. They don't have a problem with that. They've made up their mind. They're for the people. They're against the government. But when you ask them, do you want to see foreign intervention in Syria? Do you want to see Western intervention? Only a minority says yes. Most people still don't want Syria to be decided on the backs of Western airplanes or backs of Western tanks because there is that kind of discomfort with international intervention. And yet Arabs don't have a real answer to it. So you have this complex story that in some ways is connected to a history of Syria. You talked about the background and what we've seen about Syria. If you look at the the history of Syria since 1964, really since 1958, with the exception of a brief period between 61 and 64. Syria has been relatively stable since 64, despite the fact that in previous years, it was the most unstable of Arab countries. The most unstable of Arab countries. We had a change of governments there every other month practically, until the Ba'ath Party came to power. And the Ba'ath Party, which has been really in charge in Syria since 1964, the same Assad family in charge since 1970, what it brought is not just a stability of authoritarianism. It did bring that. There is no question that some of that stability is strictly a function of the ruthlessness of authoritarianism. No doubt. That is why we've had stability. But there is another layer which is connected to something bigger that has to do with the problem of Syria, which is when we think about secular Arab nationalism, it was born in Syria in its modern interpretation. It wasn't born in Egypt. Egypt popularized it. Egypt made it more meaningful. But the Ba'ath Party as a secular national party was born in Syria. And that ideology was important for overcoming the sectarianism. You have to understand that the stability wasn't just a stability of rule, but a stability of an ideology that transcended differences. For that reason, when Arab nationalism was started, the Ba'ath Party was started, some of the original backers and really creators of that ideology were not just Sunni seculars who certainly didn't want religious groups to dominate the political discourse, but it included Christians, and included Alawis, and included Druze, because Arab nationalism transcended those sects. So what we see is, in fact, over the years, there was, despite the concentration of power in the hands of few in Damascus, especially Alawis around Assad and the Assad family and people around him, there is something psychological tied to the ruling ideology that kind of seems to transcend these sectarian differences. And the breakdown of that, beyond even the breakdown of the Assad regime, seems to generate this fear of return to identities that are sectarian. That is really where we are.
Thank you for that overview. I think that's very, very helpful. I just sort of to play off of that for a second. I think that's everything you said is perfectly true. But there's the other side of that coin. For sure, the ideology brought Syrians together and served as a legitimating factor in not just Ba'athist rule, but especially the rule of Assad, father and son. But to some extent, it was a legitimating factor that rationalized a rather, yes, it operated at a certain ideological level with power and influence. But at another register, it was a rationalization for a social contract, a sort of devil's bargain, if you like, or quid pro quo between a ruling elite that was family first, then clan, then sect, and then broader groups with merchant families, with powerful families that agreed to sort of cede a great deal of power to those specific segments of society in exchange for order, in exchange for stability, in exchange for the ability to create wealth and pass it along and what have you. And that once this is broken down, as we have seen it break down, it breaks down leaving almost nothing but the sectarianism that's behind it. So in a certain counterintuitive way, this effort to overcome sectarianism by promoting an ideology that papered over really not only profound sectarian differences, but privileges for sectarian minorities and different roles for different sectarian groups. Actually, once the veneer, once the paper cover is ripped away, what is revealed is something very fierce and stark. And so I just wanted to add that. Now I'd like to ask Dr. Zaid to essentially play off of another point that Professor Telhami made, which is that there is an aspect of what's happening in Syria that participates in the broader Arab uprisings, in the Arab Spring, in the Arab awakening, whatever you want to call it. And I'd like you to address the ways in which the conflict in Syria actually reflects that broader regional aspiration.
Well, thank you, Hussein. First of all, good evening, everyone. This is a really inspiring gathering, and I would like to thank Mr. President Mustafa Fanglode for making this panel happen. As a matter of fact, I would like, before I provide a larger context of what is happening in Syria and related to the Arab Spring at large, to point to what you both gentlemen were talking about in terms of sectarianism. And I actually assume that this aspect of the socio-cultural foundation of Syrian society is a little exaggerated. I'm inclining to think that sectarianism is overplayed and overemphasized. And the issue to bring it back to objective, real analysis, to my mind, is by looking actually at the socio-political foundation of Syrian society, a variable that for so long been totally ignored in our analysis and what is happening in the Arab Spring. But even before I get to link what's happening in Syria to what happened at larger regional environment, that's the Arab Spring, let me just give this very quick remarks and notes. To start with, there is a patronizing trends, attitudes in the Western media and academia circles about what is happening in the Arab Spring and in the Arab world. This patronizing trends and attitudes saying, for example, first, well, Arabs at large cannot be democratic. They cannot have a revolution. Now, if they to have it, then they don't know what to do about it, where to go, and what kind of regime they should have. And it is our duty, our responsibility, to tell them where to go. In other words, we have to protect the Arabs from themselves so we can protect ourselves. This is a very major issues happening in the attitudes level. And we've been polling, and I think that is actually adding to the problems that are so intense in the Middle East at large. The other issue has to do actually with the reasons. We were talking about causes of what happened, why it happened in the Arab region. And here I will invite you to listen to Machiavelli, a very famous political scientist, known for being totally pragmatical, unethical, immoral in one way or another in terms of politics. Exactly. I'm talking about The Prince. So in The Prince, you might read, and it is there, that for rulers, governors, kings, presidents, it's always good to be feared than to be loved or liked. Well, it seems all Arab regimes, without exceptions, liked that phrase and implemented. And walls of fears were built. And unholy alliances, trinity actually, between families, corrupt businesses, and security agencies and institutions were formed, to the extent that you turned and transformed the political system of this overarching ideological platform to unify the society into a sultanistic kind of regime, whereby you don't have a president, you don't have a regime, you have a sultan in all, it is aspects. And, those who know what sultan means know exactly what I'm referring to, where it is a personal family business, has nothing to do even with the ideology itself. Now, what happened is very simple. It's very simple and complicated over time. And if you to look at the eve of the revolutions that took place in Tunisia and then in Egypt and the rest of the Arab Spring states, you will actually be surprised why it took him too long. I'm talking about Arabs, about the people. Why did it take him so long to get to the streets and have their revolutions? all indicators, political, economic, social, and the rest, especially human rights records, all contributed to humiliating, degrading of a citizen to a status of a people living in a country whereby you don't have citizenry, you don't have citizenship. And in fact, all basic human rights were totally violated. A great rate of poverty, unemployment. And now we have a very important things happening. You have a cohort of young people and very educated and very well connected in the world. Those cohort been totally marginalized, excluded. Now, and what happened in Tunisia saying enough is enough. All these walls of fears has to be brought down. And that's precisely what happened, to my mind, in Syria. So if we talk about what contributed to the Arab Spring at large to happen, you can look definitely at what I call it, this transformational policies of, as a consequences of the nature of the regimes, structures of the regimes that all built on fear, and the consequences of their policies, especially new liberal policies, that contributed to the marginalization and exclusion of the people of the political sphere. Now that ended up reaching or providing a platform that is so ready for all people to say, you know, whatever calculations you might have in your mind, you're gonna be losing, and the cost of keeping the status quo the way it is much more higher than resisting the status quo. This rational calculations, to my mind, triggered what happened in Tunisia and grew to be called the Arab Spring. How that is related to Syria, it is identical. The situation in Syria is not so different in terms of these all aspects and indicators of what is in Egypt and other countries. The question, of course, will be how that is applicable to Jordan or the Gulf states or different countries. I claim the whole rationale of the entire Arab political systems collapsed. That rationale was built in fear, and the fear was collapsed. And I also claim that there is a form of Arab Spring in each and every single Arab countries to its own situations and, you know, country specific, if you wish to say. In Jordan, there is a constitutional changes. In Morocco, you have the same approach of constitutional changes. There are some changes in socio-economic policies in the Gulf states. I'll be getting in more details on what's happening in Syria, looking inside the regime and inside the opposition to try to clarify what Professor Telhami is saying, very complex situation in Syria.
Yeah, thank you very much. That's extremely interesting, and I think you're absolutely right that there are common indicators that indicate a set of common causes. I just note two interesting wrinkles here, and one produces or reflects a slight disagreement that I have, and I'm going to ask Shibley what he thinks about it. One is, there's no doubt that all these states that saw these uprisings have the indicators that you mentioned, and even more factors, that particularly a lack of individual dignity, lack of accountability of authority, and arbitrary abuse by even ordinary police officers with no recourse for anybody. But in the broader socioeconomic indicators, Tunisia would have been considered one of the less likely Arab states to be the lead because its socioeconomic indicators, most broadly, were not among the worst. And it had not throttled its civil society completely, it had contained it. And it had a very arbitrary dictatorship, and there were a lot of abuses, but it was not the worst, I think, on any register. So it's interesting that it began in a place where if you were simply looking at indicators, you might think this is probably not going to be the home of it. And that's a curious thing. The other thing is that once the fear goes, that doesn't mean that there's a consensus in every Arab state of majority consensus. I mean, certainly there was a struggle in all of these countries. The easiest one was in Tunisia, One in Egypt is going on, but it's going on in a non-violent way. Being played out in the courts, it's not really legal, it's political, but it's being played out in the courts and at the ballot box and in other forums like that. In Libya, there was a war, but as Professor Telhami noted, it was not terribly prolonged, and its outcome was fairly clear early on, I think. I don't think there was much doubt. Now in Syria, and here's where I'm turning to you, I actually don't see a society with consensus. This is where I differ from you slightly. I see a society where fear has gone, but that hasn't turned everyone in the country, or that hasn't created a consensus for regime change within the country. The government still has major pockets of support among not only Alawites, but among Christians and others. Kurds are sort of neutral at the moment, trying to position themselves for advantageous situation in a post-Assad Syria, etc. What do you make of that, Shibley? We have two narratives here between the two of us. What do you think?
Well, before I address Syria, I just want to talk a little bit about what you have said about Arab revolutions broadly, particularly Tunisia. I'm not sure I agree with you on Tunisia. That is that it's true. I agree with you that economically, Tunisia wasn't the worst place where you might have expected revolution. Now, I have never thought this was all about economics. Right. Economics is important, no question. Let's not underestimate it. But the driving force, in fact, if you look at the Arab world broadly, if you look, why 2010? Why 2011? There was not a historically unique economic crisis in any of the countries that they hadn't experienced many times before. So I think the fact that there was a drive, as I've been saying for 10 years in the polls, we knew Arabs are angry, they want to get rid of their regimes. The question is, when will they have an opportunity? How will they do it? Why did it happen in Tunisia? Well, two things. One is, if you look at revolutions in general, they are not started by the poorest or the least educated. Never. At all. Never. That's not the case. And once it started, it galvanizes everyone else. The fact that it starts historically, it is an Arab revolution. I want to repeat that. Yes, it differs from country to country. There was a spillover effect. There was solidarity across the Arab world. There was a common aspirations that were captured in the streets of Tunis as they were in the streets of Cairo and Amman and everywhere else. So I think there is something aspirational. And if you look at it at a macro level, Tunisia, it doesn't look strange. But let me come back.
Do the three of us agree, just quick question before you continue, do the three of us agree that without the spark in Tunisia, this would not have spread to the other countries?
Perhaps.
Do we agree on that?
I say perhaps because here's why I say perhaps.
Okay,
because
like you to
we've talked even here in this foundation right after the revolution in Egypt. There was an excellent event, and people were brought from Tahrir Square right here before this same audience, and I was here as well. And I made the argument that if you ask why the Arab revolutions, I said first we know why. That's not a hard question to answer. Why now? It's the information revolution, because we had all assumed that you can't have a revolution without organizations to translate public anger into revolt, effective revolt. Arabs governments knew that. They didn't allow any organization to emerge. They chopped the heads before they emerged. They didn't allow charismatic leadership to emerge. What we've seen is that with the information revolution, people were able to get to the streets without any real institutional organization available. Now, that happened, the start was in Tunisia. Could it have happened in Egypt? Of course it could have happened, or it could have started in Egypt. But, this is past history. It's hard to know. But on Syria, I agree with you that there is no apparent consensus. And maybe some of it is sectarian. It's not all sectarian, because we know that Sunnis are divided, some Alawis are divided, Christians are divided, Druze are divided. The Druze even struggling with this. So we know that it's not perfectly sectarian. It never is. I mean, this is anywhere you talk about sectarian, it never is really fully sectarian. It's always partially. We're talking about majorities within every community. And so in that sense, when you look at Syria, you have to ask yourself, why has the regime been able to do this? Now, they shot at their people, which is why everybody despises them, because unlike what happened in Egypt, there was some shooting in Egypt, but limited. In Tunisia, the same thing. They shot at their own people even before the opposition organized, and then they started shooting. It became more of a civil war. Fine, but why did that not sweep them out of the gun? And that's because, not just because they have military, because the military is made up of the people. Military is not brought from the moon. They're not hired guns from the outside. They're of the people. When you have huge, heartbreaking death and destruction on the scale that we've seen, where possibly over 20,000 people dead and many thousand, wounded, and all the destruction, if that doesn't get people against the regime, they've got support somewhere. Because some people are more terrified of the regime falling than they are of the regime staying. And that hasn't changed, and that's why they're still in power. And that's why I think people are now trying to figure out where to bet. You look at foreign powers saying, I'm betting that the regime is going to stay, or I'm betting that the regime is going to fall. Because in the end, we can't fully read where Syrian society is. It is divided, no question.
So absolutely.
Okay. I'm sorry. Either way. I can work both.
They both work. Maybe you'll agree with me if I give you my mic.
Well, I'm getting closer to what you say. Well, on the issues of economy, I absolutely do agree with you. And in one of my articles, I called the Arab Revolution's revolution of dignity, and I would like to emphasize that. Now, the idea of these economic indicators are absolutely important, no doubt about it. Especially, what added to that is the international financial and economic crisis that, pushed the food prices so high to the extent that, major of the middle class and lower middle class could not cope up with. But the issue has to do with dignity, and when I'm talking about the dignity, I'm talking about the consequences of regime nature and policies that, in my mind, also led to a collective psychological transformation that gave power to people to go to the streets. Can any one of you imagine, living in Syria under Zainuddin bin Ali or under Mubarak, and that you go to the street, you're not coming back to home, you're dead, and yet you do it? What a transformational power took place in order to motivate people to go to streets, taking that risk, and almost assure that the risk is real and there. And now that has nothing to do with economy. That has to do with losing hopes. No horizontal, no horizons for people. And if you don't do it now, it probably never come. Now, it happened in Tunisia, and here I agree with you again, it could have absolutely happened in Syria at the beginning, in Egypt. And actually, indicators were saying it's going to happen in Syria and Egypt more than Tunisia. Now, on the issue of consensus and this division with Syria, there is no doubt as well that there is horizontal and vertical divide with all Arab societies. Now, it might be much more intensified in Syria comparing to other countries. Now, if you look at Tunisia and Egypt, you are faced with a more homogeneous society. While in Syria and Iraq and Lebanon, we know it is divided, and sometimes it's deeply divided. These divides, some of them are natural in terms of ethnic, sectarian, language, region. Some of them are, of course, politically made and meant to be there. Now, I guess the issue to see what is happening in Syria and what side to side with or not is to look inside the regime. Now, at the very bigger picture, you can see two teams, two players. You have the regime and you have the opposition. But actually zooming in, the picture is much more complicated. Now in the regime, who's in the regime? Who's making the decision? Is it Bashar al-Assad? This is the question now. Is it really Bashar al-Assad wants to continue doing that? Or he's forced to do that because of the old guards of the Ba'ath Party and his, the Alawite people? And now opposition. Who's leading the opposition? It is the Syrian National Council. It is the national coordinated committees that are doing there, or the grassroots. Talking about, for example, the Free Army. Is the Free Army really in charge of what's happening in Syria? What about Bin al-Walid and other brigades and other military militias within there? And how about the grassroots movements? How about the Al-Qaeda jihadi Salafist fighters, or Arab fighters coming from Libya and Iraq, or Syrians who actually were fighting in Iraq against the Americans and now came back in order to support their brethren in Syria? So it's very much complicated, and one way to do it is to game it. I mean, to see who are the actors, what are their interests, what the power they do have, and what moves they might go on. And that's where probably you can reach to equilibrium, or a balancing acts of what is happening or not.
This raises a really interesting question that I'd like all of us to consider, which is, of course, we really cannot know what the outcome of the conflict in Syria is going to be. That this is not knowable. There are too many variables, too many imponderables, too many factors and actors to know this, or to predict with any confidence. But I'd like to propose a hypothesis and see what you think about it. Because when I look at the equation, as you have described it very accurately, a government in which it is hard to imagine if the president, the de facto president, ordered his army and especially the Shabiha militia to stop, that they would almost certainly not listen to him at this point, in my view, and an opposition that is fragmented politically and militarily in the ways that you explained, and in which there are foreign powers using groups as proxies, and all of that fragmentation on top of the various different, as you put it, horizontal and vertical fragmentation, or at least distinctions that exist within Syrian society along identity lines, class, regional, etc., ethnic, sectarian. So the question, the hypothesis that I'm going to propose is that whatever the outcome is, it is extremely difficult to imagine that the unified Syrian state run in a centralized way from Damascus that has existed since independence will be a survivor of this conflict. That, in other words, some form, and we don't know what form, but some form of state fragmentation or state disintegration or regional autonomy or something like that, whether it looks like Lebanon or like Iraq or like Bosnia or like Somalia or some new form, that is virtually inevitable. I'm wondering what you think about that idea.
Inevitable, in my view, is too strong a word. I think what I envision certainly is continued instability in the region no matter what happens. In large part because of the internal dynamics, but in large part because every foreign neighbor has some stake in what happens in Syria. Mm-hmm. And those are competitive. That's the thing, is that in Iraq there was some sense that all the neighbors at a minimum wanted Iraq to be stable. They were worried about the spillover. There was some sense of that, even with the disagreements, including Iran, that initially. In this case, Turkey's interests have to do mostly with the Kurds. Hezbollah's interests in Lebanon mostly have to do with the route to Iran and with possibly the Alawis. Israel's interests are different. The U.S. is going to worry about Al-Qaeda being strong in an environment of instability. Jordan has a refugee issue and also possibly spillover of an empowered Muslim Brotherhood. Everybody has a stake, and that's a problem. But I just want to throw something else on the side here, which is that sometimes we get a little too trapped in our limited thinking about imagining futures. That people find ways to cope and redefine themselves. It happens over and over again. And I want to tell you something about Lebanon that is fascinating to me. In an environment where if you asked, now we have obviously a number of spots of trouble internally in the Arab world. But if you asked where is the most sectarianism in the Arab world, it was Lebanon. It had experienced a civil war. To this day, there's not a single community that has a majority. Every community, in the Shia, only plurality in Lebanon. And you have many, it's the most diverse country that way of any Arab country, and it's small. And it's small. Now, here's the interesting thing about Lebanon. in all the polls that I do in the Arab world, and I ask people identify themselves, are you first Arab, are you first Lebanese, are you first Jordanian, are you first Muslim? In the Arab world, those who say they are first Egyptian or Jordanian or Moroccan are a minority. In Saudi Arabia particularly, it's like less than 20%. The only place where the overwhelming majority of every sect identify themselves as Lebanese first, Lebanese, as with the state first, Lebanese, overwhelming majority, Shia, Christian. And you know why that is the case? That is the case because they're all in it together. They can't escape Lebanon. There is not a viable, neither one of them can hope to have a state of their own that's viable. Neither one of them can envision themselves joining a neighboring state. And all of them are terrified by the collapse of the state of Lebanon. And whether or not that's enough to keep them together is another story. But I just want to say that I think there is something you can imagine. But I want to give you one more idea, which
Can
is...
I ask you a question about Lebanon before
Sure.
you go? Is another factor, and I want to know what you think of this. Another potential factor is that it's not a problem for the different communities in Lebanon to identify as Lebanese because there isn't a threatening Lebanese centralized state in Beirut that threatens their local interests. So it's easy enough to say we're all Lebanese because it's not dangerous.
Yeah, but you're envisioning a situation with the regime collapsing and a situation where people are galvanized together by the fear of the absence of the state. And I think that's something that does happen. It's a fluid situation. Identities are not fixed. We all know it. They change as the environment changes. There are possibilities. But there are people... I mean, one of the things that I worry about, other than just the humanitarian consequences and obviously the strategic consequences for prolonged trouble in Syria, is that, you know, the Arab world, when you are sitting somewhere in, whether it's Algeria or anywhere else in Oman or in Amman, and you are looking at the Arab Spring that happened, I don't usually call it the Arab Spring, the Arab Awakening that happened in Tunis and Egypt, and you looked at it positively. And you see what seem to be relatively better results. Even in Egypt, those are, people are doubtful, but still people think it's a better improvement in Egypt. When you look at sustained conflict in Syria, whether in fact people start associating the Arab awakening and the uprisings with bloodshed and division in the same way that the war in Iraq terrified people, and when a dictator in Egypt would say, would you rather be in Baghdad or would you rather be in Cairo? People said, no, we want to be in Cairo, not in Baghdad. Right. So I worry about the psychological impact on the Arab awakening of a prolonged Syrian bloodshed.
So let me turn it over to you for a second. But just to note that embedded in your answer, in both parts of your answer, but especially in the first part, is the idea that a certain degree of state disintegration, in not complete fragmentation or complete failed state status, but a certain degree of state disintegration, as in the Lebanon case, could actually be, if not a utopian, certainly a not dystopian scenario. And if you could consider that as in part of your answer, I mean, I think that's a fair characterization.
It's fair, and that's why sometimes fascism comes back in environments of anarchy. Yeah. Don't forget that part.
Well, they have, it would be hard to imagine an Arab regime that's more closer to a fascist model than that has been in Syria for a while. But I understand what you're saying.
Something goes totally beyond our imagination, so you might have some. But at any rate, exactly. Now let me try to say something that is of optimistic language. Territorial integrity in Syria, I think, not in danger. So a division or a separation movement or even an Alawite state in certain parts in Syria for a period of
Not
time.
even with the Kurds, possibly? Can you not envision something?
Well, maybe, I guess this is against the entire strategic, regional strategy.
I think
in
the
the
Turks
region.
might have something to say
The
about
Turks,
that.
the Iran themselves, Iranians, the Turks, and the rest of the people. Now, this actually, the whole question of the Kurds and their possible development in the future, because of the Arab Spring, been neglected, and I think should be closely discussed because of what you are referring to. It's always a possibility, but I cannot see, because of two things actually, because of the consensus that is among Syrians, despite their device, that the territorial integrity should be kept as the way it is in Iraq. Even if we have the Kurdistan and Erbil and, a quasi-independent state, but still, they're within the integrity territorial of Iraq. Now, the issue...
I do think we agree on that, that ultimately the territorial integrity of Syria is probably not in doubt. Do we agree on that, Shibley? More or less?
More or less. I
More or
do
less.
think the Kurds are a bigger question than is being suggested.
Yeah.
All right.
But that's fine.
Let me just see the other part of the psychological consequences of what is happening in Syria, and you're absolutely right on that. What actually Libyans, what happened in Libya and Yemen, and particularly in Syria, made it too costly for people to go to the street. And then you need to recalculate. And again, the comparison you said, now I guess even the Gulf states are doing it now. Like to be in Riyadh or in Damascus, definitely in Riyadh. It's safe, at least personal safety. Now, but there are the other point. What if the revolution in Syria to succeed? Then the whole psychological thing will transform to a positive way, as actually it did, as it happened in Libya. After Libya, there was a boom in all sentiments toward what's happening. If Gaddafi can be changed, if Assad and the Ba'ath Party can be toppled down, and then everything else could happen. So I just wanted to say that.
Before we go to questions, because we're running short on time, I'd like to take a second for us to consider just a slightly little bit more depth the regional implications of what's happening, because we really focus very much on the internal question and this relationship with the Arab uprisings and the Arab awakening, whatever you want to call it. But there is a kind of something at stake very strongly. I mean, Shibley, you gave a very good summary of concerns of many of the different actors who have a stake in what's happening in Syria. But to my mind, and one actor you didn't really mention was Iran, and to my mind, the biggest impact that what's happening in Syria is likely to have in broader strategic terms regionally is on the future of Iran as a regional power. It strikes me that Iran's ability to continue to aspire to regional power status is actually very dependent on the survival of the Assad regime or a friendly regime in Syria. That it's going to be very difficult for Iran to not find itself on the defensive and not find itself greatly encumbered in its ability to project power into the Arab world if it loses a friendly regime in Damascus and is therefore further isolated. What do you make of that? Both of you, please.
Well, I think there's no question that Iran has something to lose, but not on the scale that you're suggesting, in my opinion. I mean, let's just for a moment look at how the crisis that in the Arab world that Syria has created. I mean, the first crisis is you've got a Arab public expectation that something be done to stop the bloodshed. I mean, this is a story. I mean, if you think that story is covered in international press, you haven't watched Al Jazeera, which it's the first and second and third story almost every single day, even when there are really huge stories taking place outside. It is the story that is being projected in the Arab world. And so with that, there has been undoubtedly raised expectations for doing something to stop the bloodshed. People are tired of that. And that's part of the information revolution. In 1982, when the Syrians took on the Muslim Brotherhood, when the Assad regime took on the Muslim Brotherhood and killed thousands of people. Nobody watched it. The reports came afterwards. We didn't know the scale until later. There was hardly any pressure at all to do something. Now, the information revolution has really raised expectations for intervention, and there's no one that has the capacity to do it. And so what it has revealed is not only the failure of the international system to match the rising expectations in an era of the information revolution that has transformed public expectations, not only regionally, but really internationally, where people are watching this and wanting something to be done, and yet we haven't had a parallel transformation of the United Nations or any international organizations, but certainly not Arab institutions, to be able to deal with their problems. And the vacuum that has been created by the revolution in Egypt and the trouble in Iraq. Remember, if you look at who were the most influential Arab states, in the past several decades? Well, of course, Egypt always is one of them. Saudi Arabia is the wealthiest. Iraq was close and aspiring, and Syria had a very important role because of its relationship with Israel, with confrontation with Israel principally. And so 3 of those were preoccupied. Syria is the subject of the trouble. Iraq is really outside of being influential state in the Arab world. Egypt was too busy with its own revolution. What did that leave? That left Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states, mostly the oil-producing states. So what we have seen in way of Arab policy, what has been Arab policy? Arab policy has been Gulf policy towards Syria. And that's one reason why people have been waiting for Egypt to see what Egypt is going to do. Now, Egypt had a president elected, the first elected president as a result of this revolution. He immediately announced that he wants to play a role on Syria. And what does he want to do? First, he doesn't want Western intervention. He wants to coordinate with Saudi Arabia, Turkey, and Iran. And now, whether he succeeds or not, let's put that aside. It's too big a question to tackle today. But that brings me to the Iran issue, which you have raised. Yeah. Now, if you look at Iran, it's true that the Syrian regime was the only Arab state allied with Iran. It goes back, as you know, even throughout the Iraq-Iran war in the 1980s, which is significant in the Arab world. But frankly, I am not sure how much the Iranians are getting for the relationship except for support for Hezbollah. The main asset that the Syrian regime provides to them is support for Hezbollah. Yes. Beyond that, it's hard to know, because in the public opinion polls that I conduct, Iran does pretty well, mostly because of its anti-American position, not because of its any link with any Arab regime. Because people see it as standing up to America and to Israel. And when you ask people in the Arab world, name the 2 countries that are most threatening to you personally, 80% say Israel, 70% say the United States.
Has this changed at all in the
past
past 18 months?
Changed.
No, it's consistent.
It has not changed. Iran went up from 12% to 18%. But the order of magnitude is still clustered in the two states. And so what would happen if the regime were to fall? Well, what would happen is that, it depends on what happens with Hezbollah. Right. But assuming what you said, which is going to be anarchy, division, they're going to have multiple routes for supplying Hezbollah. I mean, if that's true.
If that's true. Yeah.
If that's true, they're not going to have a problem with that. They will lose a backer in Damascus. It will be a loss for them, but it's not a strategic loss. What they're worried about is now how the relationship is going vis-a-vis Israel, vis-a-vis the nuclear question, vis-a-vis the U.S. That's where it's going to be decided. Now, the question is whether the Syria crisis could ultimately trigger a confrontation with Iran. Because economically, frankly, I mean, anyone outside, whether it's in Latin America or outside the world, says, what are the possible economic consequences for us of the Syrian crisis? Well, if it's contained, not much, because Syria is not a major oil producer. But if it spills over and draws Iran in, then huge consequences economically. And the Hezbollah factor could, although unlikely, but it could trigger some kind of an Iranian
You can imagine
confrontation.
it, definitely you can imagine it. Closing remarks along those lines before we go to questions from you, Dr.
Yes,
Zaid?
just very quickly. I mean, I totally agree with your analysis, in particular this, the Gulf taking over the Arab politics.
Yeah, I found it very persuasive as well.
It is, actually. And yes, this imagined strategic alliance between Iran and Syria is also exaggerated. Syria is important to Iran, but not important to the extent that Iran will lose its hegemonic regional role that it's aspiring for, and that's why Israel is insisting of depriving Iran from its nuclear weapons. But what I wanted actually to close up with is the following. In Syria, I would say there is the good, the bad, and the ugly as it develops. The good thing is this solidarity that's been shown at the grass level roots among resistance who does not belong to this sectarian divide and actually overcome all these divides. This solidarity, this civil resistance, they still going on. And I want to remind all of you that Syrians have been killed, and then in their protest and demonstration always say peaceful revolution. And that is like a remarkable issue in what's happening in Syria. So the good thing is this solidarity, a very sense of civic resistance of what it is, despite the fact there's the armed resistance that we know, but at the grassroots, what's happening on every day, those people are all coordinating, which is actually more than 800 coordinating cells all over Syria. The sense of the new political structure that they provide in order to keep communicate their demands and their goals. And now the bad thing is this might develop slightly to some sectarian divides, especially between Sunnis and Alawite, and that will bring the issues of collective memory and the fear of what happened in 1982 and the fear of the revenge, where Alawite, probably all the Alawite sect, will be wiped out from Syria because of their support of the regime. So that is a bad thing. But the ugliest thing, the ugly in Syria, is the radicalization issue. Radicalization issue that is taking place now because of the vacuum, because of the lack of the international interventions, because of the prolonging of the regime. There's a vacuum, and this vacuum been filled by, as I said, Al-Qaeda-like organization, jihadist Salafist, and this kind of radicalization on this part is there, and the Alawite part is there, and I think this is the ugly development in Syrian crisis.